Don't move, the warning that saved a Mafia Kingpin at a lonely diner. That was the sentence a waitress whispered into the darkness, her voice steady enough to stop death itself. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her face. But she recognized him, and what she saw behind him wasn't just danger. It was the past returning to collect a debt. The diner always felt different after midnight. It wasn't the kind of difference people notice with their eyes. It was the kind that settled in their bones, like a quiet warning whispered through vents and flickering neon. Most nights the world outside slowed to a crawl. Cars thinned into loneliness. The sky hung low, carrying the weight of unspoken things. The chrome-edged tables reflected silhouettes rather than faces, and the jukebox hummed the same old song about a love that stayed too long. But on the night this story begins, the diner felt like it was holding its breath. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way a heartbeat changes right before a truth rises from the dark. Mira Lopez had worked the late shift at Gus's Highway Diner long enough to understand that nights have personalities. Some were angry. Some were restless. Some were tender. Tonight was none of those. Tonight felt watchful. She moved with a rhythm that came from years of repetition. Refill the ketchup bottles. Wipe the chrome edges. Flip the open sign back straight because the wind always tilted it. Check on the one trucker who always fell asleep in his booth. Everything predictable. Everything familiar. Yet her chest felt tight. Not with fear but with a strange anticipation. Like something old was walking toward her, wearing the shoes of a stranger. Mira didn't believe in omens but she believed in patterns. She believed in the silences between footsteps. In the hesitation of a hand before it reaches a door. In the way air shifts a half second before someone speaks. And at 12:47 a.m. the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gust of wind. No sudden slam of the door. It was the smallest shift, the kind of shift you feel only when you've been waiting years for something you thought you forgot. The bell above the entrance gave a single tired ring. He stepped in. A man in an immaculate black coat, shoulders carved from a life of carrying dangerous things. His hair slicked back with discipline rather than vanity. Hands gloved. Eyes sharp, but dulled around the edges the way grief dulls metal. Mira saw him and felt a memory stir so fiercely that her breath faltered. She didn't know him, not by name not yet, but her body recognized something her mind had not caught up to. Something buried deep. Something saved for a moment that had finally arrived. He chose the back booth. The shadowed one. The one no one ever sat in unless they wanted to be forgotten by the world for an hour. Mira wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him with practiced calm. Yet each step felt like she was walking toward a photograph she once saw but didn't remember taking. He didn't look up when she approached. He simply sat there still as an echo. A man carrying the kind of silence that weighs more than a shout. Something in him felt familiar, like the echo of a long-ago story she once heard as a child. A story about a man who saved her father's life outside a gas station before vanishing into the fog. A man her father described only as the stranger with a scar under his eye. And there it was, faint but unmistakable. A thin line right beneath this man's left eye. A scar shaped like a crescent moon. Myra's stomach tightened as a truth pressed its hand against the glass of her memory. The stranger was not a stranger. He was the ghost her father never stopped honoring. She steadied her breathing, placed a menu on the table though she knew men like him didn't need menus. People who lived on the edges of danger often ate the same thing everywhere. Something simple, predictable, quick to swallow in case they needed to run. The silence between them settled like dust on old stories. Across the diner the jukebox flickered. The neon outside buzzed a soft complaint. The world felt suddenly too still. She stepped away, trying to piece together the timeline of her own life, to validate what her instincts already whispered. The man sitting here tonight was the reason her father made it home the night Mira turned 7. The reason her father lived long enough to teach her how to ride a bike, how to pray, how to trust the right silences and fear the wrong ones. Yet there was something else, something unsettling. Mira didn't remember him being this tired, this hollow, this hunted. He wasn't just sitting. He was bracing. A man doesn't brace unless he expects something to hit. She watched him from the counter, pretending to wipe a glass, but her thoughts churned like a river swollen with secrets. Who was after him? Why tonight? Why here? If fate had brought him back into her life, then fate was likely bringing something else with him, something darker. And that's when Mira noticed it. Not in his expression, not in his posture, but in the reflection of the diner window behind him. A shape, a silhouette sitting 2 booths away. A man she had not seen enter, not heard sit down. A man who had no drink, no plate, no reason to be there. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. What made her freeze was the detail only someone with Myra's memory, Myra's instincts, Myra's history could notice. The man's right hand rested under the table, perfectly still. Not relaxed. Not fidgeting. Still in the way a hand becomes still only when wrapped around something deadly. Her chest tightened. Her pulse quickened. But her face remained calm, the face of a woman who had served drunk truckers, angry strangers, broken families, and men who wore trouble like cologne. She walked toward the mafia boss, because by now she had no doubt who he was. The quiet kingpin. The man whispered about in alleys. The man who saved her father then disappeared into myth. He looked up finally, and when their eyes met, she knew he sensed it too. The shift in the air, the tension coiled behind him, the danger sharpening its teeth. Mira leaned in gently, as if topping off his coffee. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. It was soft, steady, deadly precise. The same tone her father once used the night he told her to run before trouble arrived. She whispered 2 words that would alter the course of both their lives. Don't move. But he didn't yet know she wasn't saving a criminal. She was saving the man who once saved her father. The man fate had returned to her table, not by coincidence, but because some debts are written not in ink, but in the rhythm of destiny itself. And the night had only begun. The moment these words left her mouth, small and precise, a quiet command cutting through the hum of the diner. Don't move. He did not flinch, and that in itself told her something. Ordinary men jump when danger brushes past their ear. This man had lived long enough with danger sitting at his table that he understood the value of stillness. Mira kept her eyes on his coffee cup, as if her only concern in the world was a refill. Her hand moved steadily. Her body blocked his view of the window, of the glass that held more truth than any conversation that night. Behind him, in the reflection, the other man remained. A dark shape in a dark booth. No plate. No mug. No menu. Only presence. Only intent. She had seen that exact posture once years ago, on a night the world had tried to end her father. Back then, the setting had not been chrome and neon. It had been a gas station that sold stale chips and gasoline that smelled like broken promises. She had been 7, clutching a plastic horse with a missing leg, watching her father close the register. The store's fluorescent lights had buzzed as if they were debating whether to stay awake. 2 men had entered, one pretending to browse, the other pretending that his hand in his jacket was just cold. Mira remembered thinking they were just customers. She remembered her father's shoulders, the way they tightened. She remembered the breath he took, the weighing of options, the quiet fear of a man who had a child in the room. And she remembered the other man. The one who stepped out of the darkness near the ice machine. The one who moved like a question mark between them and ruin. Change of plan, boys, he had said. His voice had been smooth, but his eyes were not. They were full of decisions. Later, her father would tell the story 100 times. He would talk about the man's knife, not because of how sharp it was, but because of how gently he had held it against the wrist of the would-be thief. He would describe the scar beneath the man's eye, the way it bent when he smiled as if the skin itself knew too many outcomes. The man had disarmed the situation, turned it into a bargain instead of a headline. No robbery. No blood. No police. Just a quiet warning to the 2 amateurs who thought their desperation could bully fate. Then he had turned to her father and said something Mira never heard, because her father's body blocked the sound. When he stepped back into the night, his boots had made the same kind of sound the stranger's steps made now as he crossed the tiled floor of the diner, measured, deliberate, as if each one was weighed and found necessary. Her father never forgot him. He called him the stranger. The man with the moon scar. The man who had been dangerous enough to stop danger. Mira had stored that image in the back of her mind the way some people stash emergency candles, just in case the power went out again. Now the power had gone out. Not in the diner. In the line between past and present. She straightened and stepped back from the booth, giving the man she recognized in her bones a small nod as if she had only been checking on his meal. Her face did the ordinary work. Her eyes did the extraordinary. They flicked to the window, to the reflection, to the shadow behind him. He followed the path without turning his head. His gaze slid to the glass, catching not his own outline first, but the one 2 booths away. It was subtle, the moment of recognition, a tightening in the jaw, a stilling of the shoulders. But for a man like him that was a shout. In another life, he had been born with an ordinary name. Mateo perhaps, or Daniel. In this one, the city knew him by a different name whispered over poker tables and into burner phones. Vero. A simple word that had grown into a myth. In the newspapers, he was a ghost attached to crimes no one could pin on him, a rumor with a tailored suit. In real life, he was a man who ordered his coffee black and sat with his back to the wall. Except tonight he hadn't. Tonight he had chosen the wrong booth, or maybe he had been guided there by something older than caution. He registered the waitress's warning. He registered the reflection of the man behind him, the angle of the shoulders, the way the head tilted as if listening to a voice in his own skull. Vero had lived long enough to know when death had entered a room. It rarely came screaming. Tonight it had decided to sit down and wait. Mira moved away with careful slowness, as if the only thing on her mind was the next order. She passed the counter, placed the coffee pot down, and picked up a pad she did not need. Her breath was steady, but inside everything had gone bright and loud. The instinct to scream, to call the police, to run to the back room and lock the door all rose at once. But stronger than those was another instinct, built through years of watching her father navigate men with hot tempers and cold hearts. The instinct to think before fear spent all the energy. She watched the shadow man from the edge of her vision. He did not fidget. He did not adjust his jacket. He simply waited. Waiting can be the most dangerous action of all, when it's done by someone with nothing left to lose. Myra's mind clicked through details. The way his shoulders were turned gave away that his dominant hand was the right one. The way the fabric of his coat dipped on that side suggested weight, metal. The fact that he had no food in front of him meant he wasn't here to eat and leave. He was here to complete something. The parking lot outside was half empty. A truck. An old sedan. A rental car that did not belong to any of her regulars. The wind pushed a loose napkin around like an indecisive ghost. She thought of her father again. He had been gone 3 years now, taken not by violence but by something quieter, something that dug into his lungs and refused to leave. The world had had its chance to take him early and hadn't. A stranger with a scar had interfered. For the rest of his life, her father had carried that moment like a second heart. Every time a bill came that he couldn't pay, he had sighed and said, "Life is still borrowed, Mija." Every time she complained about a bad day at the diner, he had smiled and reminded her some people don't get extra days at all. The debt had not been written down, but she knew it existed. You don't get back a stolen night without owing something to the universe. She wondered, standing there with a pad in her hand and danger breathing in the corner booth, if this was the repayment the universe had in mind. It would have been easy in some ways to shrug, to tell herself that whatever businessmen like Vero had with the rest of the world, it belonged to their world, that she had nothing to do with the calculus of crime and consequence. But the debt was personal. The scar under his eye was not a symbol in a newspaper. It was a detail from her childhood. And even if this man had sins tall enough to scrape the sky, there was one night in the ledger that tilted in his favor. The night he chose not to ignore a scared man behind a counter and a little girl with a plastic horse. That was the night that let her grow into the woman now holding the decision. On the far side of the diner, the trucker snored softly in his booth. The clock near the kitchen door ticked with exaggerated patience. The fluorescent lights hummed. Mira stepped through the familiar motions of her job, but inside she was arranging possibilities like plates on a tray. Option 1, pretend she had seen nothing. Let events unfold. Hold the illusion that her hands were clean because she hadn't touched anything. Option 2, pick up the phone, retreat to the office, dial 3 numbers. Hope law could move faster than a bullet. Option 3, interfere. Interference had always been woven into her family's history. Her father had been the kind of man who stepped between strangers in arguments, who stopped to check on cars by the roadside long before smartphones made help an easy tap away. He used to say that ignoring danger was one of the greatest luxuries of the rich. The rest of the world could not afford that kind of blindness, so she chose the most dangerous option. the one that required her to step into the story. She took a breath deep to step into the story. She took a breath deep enough to borrow courage from her lungs, then picked up a plate from the pass-through window. Gus, half-asleep cook and full-time cynic, slid a burger and fries toward her without looking up from his radio. The burger belonged to Vero. She used it as an excuse to return. Her shoes squeaked softly as she walked the corridor of booths. She could feel the gaze of the shadow man flicking toward her and then away, the way predators glance at movement to confirm it is not a threat. She reached Vero's table, set the plate down, and let her hand brush the surface of the table near his. It was the barest hint of contact, but it might as well have been a flare in the darkness. In that touch, in the angle of her body, she communicated what words could not in that moment. There is danger here and I am on your side for reasons you do not know yet. He did not look at her hand. He did not react outwardly. His eyes stayed on the plate for show, but the line of his neck changed subtly, adjusting to a posture from which he could move quickly if needed. For a brief second, Mira imagined how she must look from the outside, a tired waitress in a plain uniform, refilling coffees and delivering plates, not realizing she had stepped onto the thin line between life and death. Yet she did realize. That was the difference. The uniform hit her. The awareness defined her. As she straightened, she caught a deeper glimpse of the man she was saving. There were lines at the edges of his eyes, not just from laughter but from days spent squinting into the gray areas of life. There was a hardness in his mouth that suggested he had ordered terrible things and lived with the knowledge. And there was something else, a weight in his stare that flirted with regret. Regret, she knew, is the one thing that can complicate even a criminal's fate. She turned away and walked toward the coffee station as if that had been her only purpose, but she navigated her path with surgical care. She passed close enough to the shadow man's booth to catch the faint scent of gun oil beneath the generic aftershave. The smell was small but precise. She recognized it from the nights her father had cleaned the old revolver he never fired again after that gas station incident. What strangled her breath wasn't the scent itself. It was the feeling that life had become a circle. Gun oil and neon scars and second chances, her father and this man, all connected by invisible threads she couldn't see but had always believed existed. The shadow man's eyes tracked her, black and flat. His face was unremarkable in a way that felt deliberate. The kind of face people forget in line at a grocery store. He was young, younger than Vero, older than the fear that had probably raised him. She noticed the small tattoo peeking from under his cuff, a simple geometric shape. She filed it away without knowing why. Back at the counter, she picked up a towel and began polishing silverware she had already cleaned, a stage prop to justify staying in the open where she could see both men. What she couldn't see were the calculations happening inside Vero's head. He had walked through so many ambushes in his life that survival had begun to feel like a bad habit. Enemies came in predictable shapes, rival families, discarded partners, betrayed associates. What he hadn't expected was to find danger in a place as modest as this diner, in a town that barely qualified as a dot on his mental map of the world. He had come here tonight for a reason that had nothing to do with crime. There were some places a man could only visit when he was tired of his own legend. Gus's was one of those places. Years ago, driving between cities, he had stopped here with a younger partner. The food had been forgettable. The quiet had not. In a life full of noise, he had remembered the quiet. Lately, the noise in his world had grown unbearable. Rumors of betrayal. Numbers that did not add up. Bodyguards who glanced at their phones more than at the doors. There were things he needed to think without someone waiting outside the room counting the minutes. So he had come here. To a booth that promised anonymity and a coffee strong enough to burn the fog out of his mind. He had not expected to see the scar in the glass. Not the one under his eye. The one in the reflection. The dark silhouette holding death in his right hand. And he had not expected the waitress. The woman with tired eyes and a spine made of something better than self-preservation. "Don't move," she had whispered. The words echoed in him, stirring a different night. A gas station. A scared man and a little girl with big eyes. He had not recognized her at first. But when she leaned close, when her scent carried a memory of cheap soap and something warm like sugar, when he glimpsed the faint birthmark near her temple, The past had slipped into the present as if it had just been waiting for the door to open. He realized with a jolt that made no outward sign that this woman was the child whose fear he had once stared down along with two stupid thieves. He remembered the way her hand had clutched a broken toy. He remembered the way her father's voice had trembled when he said thank you, not in words, but in the way his shoulders dropped. Vero had done a lot of things in his life that had stained him. But now, watching this grown woman move through the aisles of a diner with deliberate courage, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider. Some of his actions had ripples that were not soaked in blood. He also understood that one of those ripples had just stepped into the way of a bullet. As he picked up a fry without appetite, he decided on two things. First, he would survive this room. Second, if survival demanded it, he would make sure the waitress did too. The decision did not make him less of whatever the world thought he was. It simply reawakened the part of him that had stepped between a gun and a gas station register once upon a time. Mira glanced at the clock. A handful of minutes had passed since the danger sat down. They felt like an hour. She knew something had to break the stalemate soon. She knew something had to break the stalemate soon. Men who come to kill do not like to wait. Waiting increases the chances that conscience, or a stranger, will interfere. She needed to change the layout of the evening. Subtly, without drawing the kind of attention that makes paranoid men act. So she reached for the light switch behind the counter, flicked it twice as if testing a faulty fixture. One of the overhead lights near the back flickered, then dimmed, tossing the rear of the diner into softer shadows. Far from obscuring the assassin, it changed the angles in the glass, shifting the reflection just enough to give Vero a clearer sense of his silhouette without turning around. It also bought her an excuse. She called toward the kitchen in a voice that carried only the strain of a worker dealing with old wiring. She said something about the breaker tripping again, about needing to check the panel. To the trucker half asleep, it sounded like background noise. To the shadow man, it was nothing. To herself, it was cover. The breaker panel sat in a small hallway near the bathrooms, not far from the back exit and not far from where the assassin would have to pass if he wanted to adjust his angle or retreat. If she moved now, she could cross the path between them and maybe force a shift. Her feet started down that hallway, heart drum beating against her ribs. As she walked, she brushed the edge of Vero's booth with her hand, a small, seemingly accidental gesture that landed like a confirmation. The message was simple: I'm doing something. Use it. She did not know that Vero had already decided to use every second she gave him. She did not know about the small pistol strapped to his ankle or the knife hidden in his jacket lining. She did not know that the assassin behind him was not just an enemy from another family but something worse. A former ally. What she knew was that there was a gun in this room, that it did not belong to the man the world would blame if he died, and that her father's life was somehow knotted into the thread of this night. At the end of the hallway, she placed her hand on the breaker box and inhaled the metallic scent of old wires and burnt dust. Her fingers trembled once, then went still. The diner, unaware it was about to become the stage of a debt being paid in full, kept humming. Outside, a truck growled past and disappeared into the highway's long forgetting. Inside, 3 lives, 1 criminal, 1 waitress, 1 young man with a gun, tilted toward a moment none of them could yet see, but all of them had, in different ways, been walking toward for years. The past had sat down at her table. Now the present was about to pull the trigger. And somewhere beyond the next few minutes, crouched in the possibilities none of them could name yet, waited the truth about who had sent the gunman, why they had chosen this night, and what saving a dangerous man would cost Mira in the currency of her own soul. The diner, still holding its breath, waited to find out which debt would come due first. The moment hovered between them, stretched thin as wire, ready to snap. In the cramped hallway near's wire, ready to snap. In the cramped hallway near the breaker box, Mira pressed her palm against cold metal and tried to slow her breathing. The shadows around her felt heavier than they should. The diner's hum had softened into something tighter, like the air itself understood what a misstep could cost. Behind her, the room remained deceptively ordinary. A sleeping trucker. A half-finished plate. A jukebox murmuring an old country song about second chances that rarely came. But beneath the surface, currents shifted, quiet, electric, hungry. She sensed movement before she heard it. The soft scrape of a shoe. A weight shifting in the booth where the shadow man sat. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to mean something had changed. He was adjusting. preparing, patience running out. And she knew the truth then. There wouldn't be time for the police. There wouldn't be time for careful plans or calling for help. Fate had given her seconds, not minutes. The kind of seconds that reshape lives and rewrite how the world remembers a night. The breaker hummed beneath her fingers. A low, steady vibration. Touching it felt like touching the pulse of the diner itself. She knew how the old wiring behaved. A flicker could plunge half the room into darkness if she hit it just right. Darkness could be panic. Panic could be survival. Or it could be the spark that sent the assassin lunging. She didn't move yet. She let the decision simmer. Sometimes the body knows what to do before courage catches up. Back in the booth, Vero sat like a man carved from stone. The only sign of life, the slight tension in his jaw. The small twitch of a muscle beneath the scar that had once changed a little girl's life. The knife in his jacket felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of what taking it out would mean. He had lived too long with his hands stained by necessity. Tonight he wanted to avoid adding a new shade. But wanting peace and receiving it were two different things. And death did not care about desire. He watched Myra's reflection in the metal sliver of the napkin dispenser. Watched her breathe. Watched her square her shoulders like someone walking into cold water. He didn't know what she planned, but he recognized the moment a person decides to stop being a bystander. He had seen men die for less. And he had seen miracles born from the ordinary bravery of ordinary people who refused to be small. In the corner booth, the young man slowly turned his head. His eyes followed Mira through the mirror's fractured angles. His hand tightened beneath the table. The slight shift of his wrist was intimate, like a confession only danger could understand. He was close now, close to acting. Close to deciding on the moment he'd rehearsed. This was his first real job. Vero could see it in the posture. In the way fear and ambition mixed behind his face. First-timers always held their gun like it was a question they were afraid to ask. But fear made them unpredictable. And unpredictability killed. Myra's fingertips hovered near the breaker. She could feel the metal warming under her touch. She imagined the lights dropping, the assassin startled, the brief window of confusion. Enough time for Vero to move. Enough time for her to run. Or enough time for everything to explode. She closed her eyes for a single breath. Her father's voice rose in her memory. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the voice he used when teaching her how to make tough decisions without letting fear bend them. When danger enters the room, Mija, listen to the quietest part of yourself. It's usually the truth trying to talk. The quietest part of her said, now. She flicked the breaker down. The diner dropped into half-darkness, one row of lights popping out, the others dimming into a warm amber gloom. It wasn't total blackout, but it was enough to shake the frame of the moment. The trucker startled awake, muttered something about the power bill. The jukebox glitched mid-lyric. A low buzz drowned in the hum of old circuits protesting the sudden shift. The shadow man moved. Not dramatically. Just enough. His shoulders tightened. His hand slid fully around the grip beneath the table. His gaze darted toward the hallway, toward Myra's silhouette framed in the weakened light. Vero's eyes narrowed. He recognized the shift, the almost invisible signal that the strike was moments away. The assassin leaned forward. Mira saw it from the corner of her eye, a shape rising from the booth, shadow separating from shadow, the outline of a man entering the reality she hoped to delay. She didn't think. Thinking would have been too slow. She let her body turn toward him, stepping into the aisle as if she belonged there, as if she were just a waitress responding to a power glitch. Her movement forced him to adjust his trajectory. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to break his rhythm. Enough to change the angle. He disliked the interruption. She felt that dislike like a cold breeze passing through her. The trucker snorted back into sleep. The assassin lifted his gaze toward her. And in that moment Mira saw something she had not expected. Eyes too young to be doing this. Eyes that were almost apologetic under the surface. As if he had once been someone who believed life could offer him more than violence. But life, for some people, stops offering choices long before the world realizes it. He reached beneath the table. Vero moved. It was subtle, a shift of weight, a preparation, the slight rise of his heel. But Mira saw it. And because she saw it, she understood that Vero was not a man who waited for fate to choose for him. She took one step closer to the assassin. A waitress walking a familiar path. A woman stepping between a gun and the man who once stepped between a gun and her childhood. The assassin lifted the weapon. Everything slowed. The world held its breath so tightly Mira could hear the hum of the neon sign outside vibrating like a trapped insect. The rain on the windows seemed suspended. Her pulse thundered in her ears like something ancient. She whispered something, not loud enough for anyone to hear, maybe not even meaningful, maybe just an instinctive plea for the universe to be kind for once. Vero rose from his booth. The assassin straightened his arm. Mira moved without plan or reason, driven by a memory that wasn't hers alone. Her father's gratitude, her own safety that night long ago, the belief that debts paid in kindness are not debts at all but promises. Her body crossed the narrow aisle in front of Vero just as the assassin committed to the action he couldn't erase. An arm jerked. A breath caught. A shadow reached. And in the second before the world shattered, Mira realized two things at once. The assassin wasn't aiming at Vero. He was aiming at her. The past had returned, but so had the cost. And the diner, still wrapped in warm dimness, braced for the kind of truth only violence can reveal. The world did not explode in a single noise. It fractured in layers, sound peeling away from sound, movement staggering into pieces, reality splintering into the spaces between breath and heartbeat. Time did not slow. It deepened. The diner, once a cheap sanctuary of chrome and coffee steam, became a cathedral of danger and memory. Every angle sharpened. Every shadow leaned forward. Every object's silence felt like it held a secret. Mira didn't scream. Heroes do not scream when instinct leads. She only felt her body turning, too slow and too fast at once, her breath folding in on itself, her hand brushing the air as if trying to protect someone behind her. She had not stepped in front of Vero by accident. She had not placed herself in the path of danger unconsciously. Some debts write themselves into the bones long before the mind accepts the handwriting. And now hers had come due. The assassin's arm rose in a single brutal extension, the motion smooth, almost tender, the way a violinist lifts a bow. His face carried no hatred, only resignation. The resignation of a boy who had been taught how to pull a trigger before he learned how to tell someone he was afraid. His jacket shifted. His wrist locked. The gun cleared the table's edge. Vero saw it. His breath hitched only once, but the kind of hitch that belongs to a man who understands exactly what is about to vanish from the world. Because Mira wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a passing moment. She was a memory connected to the only act of mercy he had allowed himself in decades. She was the part of his past that proved he had not always been made of stone. And she was stepping into a bullet meant for him without even knowing the full truth. The assassin's finger tightened. But the bullet never came. Not yet. Because fate, like danger, has timing. In the fraction of a heartbeat between decision and consequence, the world shifted in two directions at once. Vero stood, not with the speed of a man seasoned in violence, but with the precision of someone who had survived more ambushes than mornings. His body rose, muscles flowing under the fabric of his coat like a shadow finding its shape. His hand dipped toward his jacket, not to draw the knife yet, but to prepare the arm that would shield what he had not expected to protect. His knee struck the booth's edge. His foot pivoted. His shoulders squared. And in the same instant Myra's foot caught the edge of a loose tile. It was subtle, an almost invisible imperfection that she had stepped over 1,000 times, a flaw she'd memorized out of habit, but her mind was so locked on the assassin, on the widening horror in his cold eyes, on the fragile unfolding of this night, that her body didn't lift in time. Her shoe dragged. Her weight shifted. And she collapsed into a fall that should have ended everything. But the fall saved her. Because the assassin, trained or desperate or both, fired at the height where a standing torso should have been. The bullet sliced through air, where Myra's heart would have been. Instead it tore through a napkin holder. Metal sheared. Chrome exploded in sparks. The sound wasn't loud, it was sharp. A snapping crack that sliced the quiet like a blade through silk. Mira hit the floor, breath ripped from her lungs, palms scraping linoleum. Pain shot through her wrists, her hip, her breath. But she was alive. Vero moved before the instinct even finished forming. He threw his body sideways, not toward the assassin but toward the opening between booths, a space he needed to reach before the gunman recalibrated. His hand flew to the knife under his coat. The blade was small but crafted for speed. He had used it only 3 times in 20 years. He had hoped never to see it again. But tonight asked for the past. The assassin rose from the booth like a dark tide, his face tightening, his finger twitching for a second shot. He did not intend to waste time. The fall of his target had confused him for half a second, but training, even amateur training, teaches the body to pursue the larger threat first. Vero was that threat. The assassin's wrist tilted again, finger curling. But 2 things happened simultaneously, 2 things neither Mira nor the gunman expected. The trucker woke up, and the jukebox glitched back into life. The trucker's body jerked with a snort, his arms flinging out. The movement created a ripple through the diner, like a stone dropped into a still pond. His startled wakefulness drew the assassin's eye, not enough to break focus, but enough to fracture it. And the jukebox, half dimmed by the earlier flicker, coughed out a distorted note, an eerie warbling bit of music from the middle of an old song about broken oaths and unfinished love. The music, wrong and ghost-like, cut through the air, disturbing the assassin's aim by a single inch. An inch that mattered. The second bullet cracked into ceramic tiles, shattering a wall clock. The hands fell to the ground, both snapping at once. Time briefly had no direction. Vero lunged. The assassin shifted. Mira gasped and rolled to her knees, fingers trembling, adrenaline pounding like war drums in her veins. She did not know how to fight. She did not know how to stop a man like the one raising his weapon again. But she knew something else. Something her father had taught her without ever saying it aloud. Sometimes survival is not about strength. Sometimes it's about disruption. She grabbed the nearest object. A metal tray. Cold. Light. Useless in any other moment. She hurled it. The throw was clumsy. She had never been athletic. The tray didn't slice through the air like some dramatic prop. It wobbled, dipped, spun awkwardly. But it hit. It struck the assassin's forearm with a hollow clang. Not enough to injure. Not enough to disarm. But enough to interrupt. Enough to stall. Enough to shift possibility. Vero seized the opening. He slammed his forearm into the edge of the booth, propelling himself forward in a single violent arc. His knife flashed, not in a dramatic flare, but in a brief glint of metal that belonged to a man who understood anatomy and consequence. He did not stab to kill. Not yet. He stabbed to unmake the shot. His blade drove into the assassin's shoulder, slicing clean between muscle fibers. A cry broke from the younger man, sharp, surprised, betrayed by his own body. The gun clattered. It slid across the table, bounced off a sugar dispenser, and spun across the floor, skidding to a stop near Myra's knee. She stared at it, breath stuttering. She had never been this close to a weapon outside her father's locked drawer. She could feel the cold metal's energy from inches away, could sense the violence still radiating off it like heat. The assassin stumbled backward, clutching his arm, face pale, breath ragged. He was not prepared for the pain. Not prepared for the resistance. Not prepared for the woman whose quiet courage had ruined the geometry of his attack. But Vero wasn't done. He rose to his full height, tall, shadowed, terrifying in a way that belonged not to myth but to memory. The scar under his eye tightened as he stepped between Mira and the gunman. And for the first time since he entered the diner, Vero spoke. Not loudly. Not violently. A voice like gravel softened by grief. You shouldn't have come here. The assassin blinked through pain, shock flickering through his eyes. Something about Vero's tone, the calmness, the certainty, rattled him more than the wound. Men who had nothing left to lose screamed. Men with power spoke quietly. Mira forced herself up, teeth clenched through the pain in her wrists. Her breath trembled, but her voice, when she found it, was steady enough to stand on. She whispered, mostly to herself, "This isn't finished." She didn't know how right she was. Because the assassin wasn't alone. He had not acted out of personal vengeance. He had not found Vero by coincidence. He had not wandered into the diner by mistake. There were threads outside this night. Threads stretching into the city, into Vero's past, into choices made by men he once trusted. Threads that were now pulling tight. The young killer's gaze flicked toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward something outside that held more promise than escape. And Mira noticed. She followed the line of his glance and her stomach dropped. A second figure. Across the asphalt. A silhouette leaning against the hood of a rental car. watching. The first assassin hadn't come alone. He had come as the distraction. The real danger had just begun to move. Vero saw it a heartbeat later. His jaw tightened. The scar under his eye twitched. And the truth settled over him like a final verdict. Whoever wanted him dead hadn't sent a warning. They had sent a team. And they would not leave without completing the job. The diner, heavy with fear and fate, felt suddenly very small. Mira stood, breath trembling, body bruised but upright, her father's courage echoing through her limbs. Vero shifted into a stance he had not used in years. The wounded assassin steadied his breath, preparing for another strike, and outside the second figure pushed away from the car, footsteps slow, deliberate, carrying the kind of intention that ends stories or rewrites them entirely. The night was far from over. It was only now beginning its steep descent toward the truth. A truth Mira didn't yet know she was tied to, and a truth Vero had spent his entire life trying to outrun. Outside, the highway kept moving as if nothing strange were happening at all. Trucks rolled past in long, tired lines, headlights sweeping the low clouds, carrying stories that would never touch this little diner. On the other side of the glass, the night still smelled of rain and gasoline. But to the people inside, it felt like the universe had shrunk to 4 people, 1 gun, and a decision. The second figure crossed the parking lot with the calm of someone who had never needed to hurry a day in his life. His pace was steady, even each footfall a measured choice. Not the jittery stride of the wounded boy inside, not the swagger of a street thug needing to impress the dark. His movements wrote a different story. This was someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mira saw him first in reflections, the same way she'd seen the first danger, except this time she was looking for it. The glass framed his shape in fragments. A dark coat, a pale face, hands in pockets, shoulders relaxed but wrong in their ease. The kind of wrong that comes from knowing how many ways a room can be made to bend. Inside, the wounded assassin pressed his hand harder against his shoulder, crimson soaking the fabric between his fingers. Pain had redrawn his posture. He no longer sat like a weapon. He sat like a boy who'd stumbled into the cost of being one. Vero stood between him and Mira, his body a wall that had learned too late what it meant to be protective. He hadn't taken a life in years with his own hands. Delegation had become his sin. But tonight the distance between order and act had collapsed. The blade in his hand still glistened. The copper scent of blood mingled with fryer oil and old coffee. The gun lay near Myra's foot, heavy even without being lifted. She stared at it, chest rising and falling in panicked waves, struck by how ordinary it looked. Not a monster. Just a tool waiting for flesh to decide what to do with it. She wanted to kick it away, to put it somewhere no one could reach, but her legs were shaking and her lungs still hadn't forgiven the floor for meeting them so brutally. Outside, the second man reached the door. The bell rang as he entered, the same tired chime that had greeted every restless soul and lonely trucker for 20 years. Somehow the sound felt different now. Sharper. Final. He paused in the doorway, not out of surprise but to take inventory. Eyes sweeping the room, catching everything. The broken clock raining its hands onto the floor, the bullet scars in the wall, the trucker half standing, half confused, the cook peering out from the kitchen with a spatula frozen midair, the wounded youth clutching his shoulder, the waitress with bruises forming on her knees and fear stiff in her spine, the man with the moon scar standing poised, knife in hand, between them. His gaze narrowed slightly when it landed on Vero. Not shock. Recognition. The recognition of someone reading a familiar headline for the 1000th time. He took his hands out of his pockets. No gun showed. Just fingers that had learned both softness and violence and kept neither on display. Mira noticed his age first. Older than the boy, younger than Vero. Lines at the mouth from years of holding back what he wanted to say. Eyes the color of smoke. Not the bright recklessness of youth. Not the deadened calm of someone who'd stopped caring. Something in between, a man still deciding what kind of ghost he would one day become. He stepped fully inside, letting the door hiss shut behind him. The neon light from outside sketched its weak glow along the edges of his coat, tracing him in tired blue. The trucker blurted something about calling the cops. The newcomer didn't even look at him. A tilt of the head, a small empty glance from Vero, and the trucker thought better of it, sinking back into the booth as if gravity had increased just for him. Mira suddenly understood why stories used words like presence. Some people entered a room and it felt like weather changing. The temperature here didn't shift, but the air gathered around this second man like it had been waiting. Vero did not move away from his place between Mira and the wounded boy. The second man's attention drifted to the younger assassin for a brief moment. A faint crease appeared between his brows. Not compassion. Assessment. As if he were appraising a damaged piece of equipment. The boy dropped his gaze, jaw tight, shoulders hitching with the effort of keeping himself upright. There was a history there. Mira could feel it in the way the boy's eyes flickered with something like shame. The newcomer turned back to Vero. When he spoke, his voice carried no rage, no theatrics. Just a tired authority, low and controlled, the kind of voice people hear in their memory long after the conversation ends. He addressed Vero by his name. Not the whispered street version but the given one. The one from before myths and headlines. The sound of it seemed to pull the older man back through years in an instant. Mira watched Vero's shoulders shift. The reaction was small but telling. She had thought of him as someone alone. A planet with its own orbit of fear around it. But this man, whoever he was, belonged to Vero's private sky. Someone from the constellation of his earliest choices. The newcomer reminded him, almost conversationally, of where they'd last met. A warehouse near the docks. A night with rain and crates and a decision that had gone one way because Vero said so. Not a threat, just a fact placed on the table like cutlery. Mira didn't catch every word. But she caught enough. Years, loyalty, percentages, words like restructure and loose ends. It was the language of men who thought in ledgers as easily as blood. All at once, the picture widened in her mind. This wasn't random. This wasn't some rival sending faceless killers. These were men who had once stood on the same side of a story. Men whose paths had diverged at the point where conscience and greed drew different maps. Vero finally replied. His words quiet, soaked in weariness. He spoke of being done. Of tiredness that money didn't fix. Of an agreement to walk away. He mentioned family in a tone that suggested he meant more than just blood. The businesses he had tried to make cleaner. The lines he had refused to cross recently that once he might have. The younger assassin's jaw clenched at that. Mira caught it. The betrayal in his gaze. As if he had signed up for one kind of leader and been handed another. The man near the door took a few slow steps inward. Shoes whispering against the scuffed floor. He acknowledged what Vero said, the retirement, the attempts to legitimize the hospitals and scholarships plastered over a foundation of bones. He even agreed that Vero had done more than most men in their world to leave something decent behind. Then he said the quiet part. Legacies didn't erase old debts, only delayed their collection. Men Vero had hurt or cut off or outmaneuvered now smelled weakness. They weren't going to let him fade into comfort with all his secrets and contacts intact. In their language, walking away was not an exit. It was provocation. Mira listened, heart pounding, feeling as though she was standing inside a confession she hadn't asked for. These men weren't arguing over abstract power. They were discussing the cost of ending a life that had shaped too many others. The newcomer finally looked at her properly, and something in his gaze shifted. For the first time, he seemed to see her not just as collateral but as a person. His eyes traced the bruise already blooming near her wrist, the rawness on her palms, the badge with her name pinned crookedly to her uniform. He could have dismissed her. But he didn't. He asked Vero who she was with a single glance. Vero hesitated just long enough for Mira to notice. Then he answered, voice flat, that she was no one. Just a waitress. The lie hung briefly in the air, thin and sad. Mira felt it like a small cut. Not because she wanted to be more to him, but because it reminded her how easy it was for men like this to protect others by erasing them. The newcomer didn't fully believe it. His eyes lingered a heartbeat longer on the faint birthmark near her temple, on the echo of something he couldn't place. But he had business to finish. He said they could keep things simple. The boy had botched the first attempt, but the result didn't need to change. Vero could step outside. Carr could pull away. The world would chalk it up to the kind of ending everyone had predicted for him anyway. The waitress and the trucker and the cook could all forget the exact faces and live to tell a softer version of the story. He almost sounded reasonable. Myra's chest constricted. The offer slid into the room like a compromise. Let one man die who deserved it, keep the rest untouched. A twisted mercy. Her eyes flickered to Vero. His face was difficult to read. Men who'd spent their lives being watched learned that early. But she saw the crack in his composure when the newcomer spoke as if her life were something he could casually protect by walking out to his own. That wasn't entirely true. She understood enough about these worlds, from whispered stories, from news reports, from inconsistencies in her father's past, to know that witnesses rarely stayed untouched. Still, the newcomer kept talking as if decency had rules in their business. Vero's hand tightened around the knife, but he didn't raise it. He was calculating. Not escape routes or angles of attack. Consequences. He had agreed, in some unspoken place inside himself, to accept whatever ending his older sins had earned. The problem was that the past had walked into the diner wearing an apron and a name tag. He could live with his own judgment. He couldn't live with hers. Mira realized then that he knew exactly who she was. The recognition she'd felt earlier hadn't lived in just her. In some recess of his mind, he'd carried the image of a 7-year-old girl with big eyes and a broken toy horse through years of meetings and bullets and banquets. And here she stood between him and yet another bullet, because once, he had stepped between her and the first. Her father had always said that kindness could change the route of a life. What he hadn't said was that changed the route of a life. What he hadn't said was that sometimes it made a circle. The newcomer shifted his weight, hands still visible, posture open in a way meant to soothe while his words sharpened. He told Vero that if he resisted, the story would get messy. Cops would be paid to lose interest. Someone would leak something ugly about the waitress. The diner would be painted as a front. Innocent lives could be folded into a narrative that made them easier to discard. He said all of this calmly, like someone explaining weather patterns. Mira understood what he was doing. He was turning her into a lever. Vero heard it too. The knife in his hand suddenly felt like less of a weapon and more of a confession. Every path he saw seemed to end in ruin. For her. For the boy. For anyone near the blast radius of his history. The younger assassin, still clutching his shoulder, finally spoke, voice rough with pain and something like desperation. He asked why the plan had changed. Why this had become so complicated. This wasn't how he'd pictured his first real job. Half blind with pain, humiliated in front of a man he both feared and idolized, under the eyes of a woman he had almost killed without even knowing her name. The newcomer told him quietly that plans always changed when people insisted on being human at the wrong time. The boy's jaw trembled. For a moment Mira saw someone else there, not a killer, but a kid standing at the edge of the wrong door, asking the wrong person for work. Someone who might once have walked past this diner and thought of stopping in for a burger before realizing he had no money. She thought of the small tattoo on his wrist. Wondered if there had been a moment when that ink was fresh and new, and he'd believed it meant belonging, not bondage. Her father had worked 2 jobs so she wouldn't have to look for family in the shadows. But even he hadn't been able to keep the darker world completely outside their door. There had been nights he came home late, knuckles bloodied, jacket smelling of fear that wasn't entirely his own. He'd brushed off her questions, said things about unlucky customers, about kids fighting outside his store. Later, after he died, she'd found an old ledger tucked in a box under his bed. Numbers. Names abbreviated into letters. Payments that didn't match the gas station's flow of business. Protection, he'd called it once when he thought she was asleep. Just enough entanglement to keep wolves away. Tied through a man with a scar who played both sides of the fence trying, in his own crooked way, to keep some people safe. Now that same man was standing in her diner, and the wolves were here with clearer paperwork. The newcomer's gaze slid back to her. He weighed something in his head. Mira could almost see it. Whether she would survive. Whether she mattered. Whether the story would be easier to control with or without her breathing on the other side of it. She realized then that no one in this room was truly safe. Not the boy, not the cook, not the trucker, not even the man giving orders. The system they belonged to ate its own when it got hungry. Her fear shifted into something else. Not courage yet. Something raw or anger. Anger that her father had spent nights bargaining with invisible men so she could have a simple life, only for that life to loop back into the same ledger. Anger that people like the newcomer could speak of lives as if they were just variables in a risk assessment. Anger that kindness, that fragile, rare thing, had been dragged into this place wearing a scar and a bullet wound and a wet footprint on the mat by the door. She bent slowly, fingers closing around the gun on the floor. It was heavier than she expected. Cold seeped into her skin. Her hand shook, not with the thrill of power but with the horror of holding an option she never wanted. Vero tensed when he saw her lift it. The younger assassin's eyes widened. The newcomer's brows rose a fraction, the first easily readable emotion on his face. Mira did not raise the gun in a clean movie-perfect line. Her arm wavered. Her elbow locked incorrectly. She had never been taught how to do this. She only knew that if someone else snatched it up, the night would end in a way she couldn't bear. She didn't point it at the boy, or at the man who just walked in, or even at Vero. Somewhere deep down, she understood that aiming it at everyone at once was the truest representation of the situation. But her hand, guided by something quieter than logic, settled awkwardly, the barrel angled vaguely toward the floor between them all, a statement rather than a threat. The room held still. She spoke then. Her voice wasn't loud, didn't crack like a whip. It came out hoarse, tired, threaded with everything she'd swallowed for years. She said no. No to the idea that this was simple. No to the trade they were offering. No to the suggestion that her life was a footnote in Vero's story. No to the notion that the boy in the booth had to become a weapon forever just because someone had placed one in his hand once. The word hung in the air like a small stubborn star. The newcomer blinked, as if he hadn't accounted for the possibility that the waitress would be the one to redraw the lines. Vero watched her, something like sorrow deepening in his eyes. He had seen people refuse him before, but never like this. Not with shaking hands and a bruised hip and a name tag that costs minimum wage. Not fueled by love for a man who wasn't even here anymore. Her father. And by a debt she shouldn't have had to consider repaying. He realized with a clarity that cut through the fog of years, that this was what his father had meant when he'd once said, "There will come a day when you meet someone your power cannot protect, only endanger. That will be the bill." The newcomer took one more step forward. He told her gently that this wasn't her fight. She replied, no longer whispering inside herself, that it had become her fight the moment someone pointed a gun at her chest and used another man's sins to justify it. She didn't speak eloquently. She didn't know how to shape speeches. Her sentences came out bent, clumsy, half-finished. But sometimes the heart doesn't need grammar to make itself understood. She talked about a gas station years ago, about a little girl and a stranger who stepped in, about a father who had stayed alive long enough to watch that girl grow up, because someone dangerous had chosen mercy for once. About how that man was standing here now, drowning in debts that never stayed paid. Her eyes flicked to the younger assassin. She asked, not in those exact words but in the tremor of her tone, whether this boy wanted his one act of violence to be the thing a stranger's child remembered for the rest of her life. The boy looked away, throat tightening. The newcomer listened, his face unreadable. Her story gave him information he hadn't had. That Vero's hands had been in lives much smaller than hospital foundations and investment portfolios. That the ripples of his past kindness cut across the myth of him as cleanly as his more famous cruelties. For a moment a crack showed. He looked at Vero with something like irritation and weary respect mixed. Why, his silence seemed to say, did you always complicate things? Vero finally lowered the knife. Not in surrender, not entirely. More in acknowledgement that the next move wasn't his alone anymore. He looked at Mira, at the gun in her shaking hand, at the boy bleeding into the vinyl seat, at the man standing near the door carrying 1,000 decisions in his pockets. He saw the diner, the broken clock, the humming lights, the grease-stained menus, the little vase with a fake flower on the counter. He thought of the life he had tried to build on top of an old crime soil. He thought of the children in schools his money had kept open, of the shelters and scholarships and programs. He thought of the graves that did not care how many good deeds you stacked on their names. He understood that his attempt to walk away had not erased his story. It had just created a cliff others now wanted to push him off. But for the first time he also understood something he'd never really believed before. There was a way to tell the truth about himself that wasn't written by the men who wanted him dead. All his life he had controlled narratives with fear, with silence, with money. Tonight, a waitress with no power had shaken him into seeing another tool. He straightened, turned slightly, and did a thing no one in their world did easily. He announced in a calm and steady voice that he was done letting men like the newcomer decide how his story ended. If their world demanded his death, it would not get the satisfaction of doing it in the dark. He spoke of names, accounts, routes, people in suits and uniforms who pretended they didn't know where their comforts came from. He said these things not as threats, but as a simple catalog of what he carried in his head. The newcomer's eyes darkened. This was the kind of danger that frightened men like him more than guns did. Information. Confession. Mira realized with a small stab of dread what Vero was doing. He was turning himself into leverage. Not for power, for protection. Into leverage. Not for power, for protection. Not for himself, for her. For anyone this night might sweep under its rug. He told the newcomer quietly that if anything happened in this diner tonight, there were envelopes in motion, people instructed years ago for just such a contingency. Records that would surface. Stories that would be told in places these men did not control. Whether it was true or not didn't matter as much as the conviction with which he said it. The newcomer studied him a long moment, weighing decades of knowing him against the possibility that he was bluffing. Vero had been many things, but reckless with his own skin had never been one of them. If he was playing this card, it meant he had accepted a certain kind of end. The boy in the booth stared at his hands, blood sliding between his fingers. Myra's arm ached from holding the gun. She wanted to drop it, to wash her hands until the cold left. But she held on because there were moments when letting go was more dangerous than clinging. The cook finally stepped a little farther into view, spatula still in his grip like a ridiculous weapon. He didn't say anything. But his move meant something. Witnesses were no longer hypothetical. People were awake, watching, ready to testify, even if they didn't yet know to whom. The newcomer sighed then. It was a small sound, but it carried the weight of an exhausted system seeing its easiest route blocked. He told Vero that he was making things harder than they needed to be. Then he corrected himself. That was always who Vero had been. He glanced once more at Mira, at the boy, at the cook, at the trucker pretending not to exist. He looked at the broken clock, hands scattered at his feet, as if noting the symbolism almost against his will. Then he did a thing none of them expected. He stepped back. Not far. Not all the way to safety. Just enough to signal that tonight's outcome was no longer a simple equation. He said in a tone edged with warning that this wasn't over. That other men would not be as patient. That the world Vero had helped build would not let him walk upright without demanding a steeper price. But he also said something else, softer, almost to himself, that every empire rots from inside first. Maybe this was the smell. He told the boy to get up. The younger assassin staggered, breath hissing as his wounded shoulder protested. He glanced at Mira, shame and confusion and some fragile, surviving piece of decency colliding in his eyes. He bent for a heartbeat, as if he meant to pick up the gun by her feet, then thought better of it when he saw the way her fingers tightened. He left it there. They moved toward the door together. At the threshold, the newcomer paused and looked back at Vero one last time. In that look was a warning, yes, but also a grim acknowledgement. Whatever came next would not be as neat as a bullet in a diner. It would be slower, more public, less controlled. Vero had dragged the conflict out of alleys and into a place where ordinary people stood. For men who thrived on shadows, that was the most unforgivable act. The bell rang again as they left. The door closed. The neon settled back into its tired hum. Silence dropped heavy, then slowly began to unravel into sound again, the jukebox muttering the end of its broken song, the fridge humming, the trucker exhaling, the cook cursing under his breath about kids these days and their violence, the rain outside picking up as if cued. Myra's knees buckled. Vero reached her before the floor did, one hand catching her elbow, the other gently guiding the gun out of her grip. He didn't point it at anyone. He laid it on the table as if it had never belonged here in the first place. For the first time that night, up close without adrenaline distorting the angles, she saw his face not as a myth, not as her father's half-remembered savior, not as the city's shadow, but as a man carrying an unbearable ledger inside his ribs. In the broken clock's reflection on the floor, they were just two people standing too close to the edge of the same story. She realized with a quiet shock that saving his life had not ended anything. It had only begun the part where both of them would have to decide what to do with the truth now sitting between them like an uninvited guest. The night outside deepened. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed for someone else's emergency. Inside the diner, time, freed of its broken hands, began moving differently. Not forward. Not back. Inward. The aftermath did not come as relief. It came as a slow, unsettling shift of weight, like a building settling after an earthquake, aware it was still standing but uncertain which beams might fail next. The diner felt both too small and too vast at the same time. Too small to hold everything that had just happened. Too vast in the silence that followed. A silence that kept stretching and stretching, as if waiting for someone to claim ownership of the wreckage. Mira stood there, breathing unevenly, her hands empty now and trembling with the aftershock of holding something she never should have touched. The weight of the gun still lingered in her tendons, a ghost memory etched into muscle. Her knees felt wet. She looked down and realized she'd landed in a puddle of spilled soda when she'd fallen. The scent of syrup clung to her skin, sharp and metallic alongside the faint smell of gunpowder. Vero remained beside her, still but not frozen. He was the kind of stillness that wasn't paralysis, it was calculation wrapped in exhaustion. His posture wasn't defensive anymore, it was protective. A shift so subtle it felt like the air recognized it before Mira did. He said nothing. The cook, Gus, stepped out from behind the kitchen half-wall, spatula still in his grip like a sword made useless by time. His face had drained of color, anger and confusion wrestling in his expression. He muttered, "What the hell just happened?" But his voice lacked the weight of someone demanding answers. It was the voice of a man asking the universe why chaos had wandered into his kitchen. The trucker in the corner, Harvey, who always ordered black coffee and apple pie, was sitting bolt upright now, staring at the shattered clock like it might start speaking. His hands, rough and callous from hauling freight across state lines, trembled around his empty mug. Mira swallowed hard, tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline. Her throat hurt. Her wrists hurt. Her brain felt like it had been turned inside out. She turned to face Vero. But before she could speak, something else happened. The younger assassin's blood hit the floor. It was a soft sound, barely a patter, but it pulled everyone's attention at once. He had slumped back into the booth, face pale, his breathing shallow. The wound Vero had given him was deep, not fatal but damaging. Enough to drain him. Enough to remind him that being dangerous didn't make him invincible. And enough to remind Mira that people weren't just heroes or villains. Sometimes they were simply lost. She stepped toward him instinctively. Vero caught her wrist, but gently, not to restrain her, but to steady her. His touch carried a history neither had yet spoken aloud. "You don't have to," he began. But Mira pulled her arm free, more from trembling determination than defiance. "He's bleeding," she whispered. Her voice shook with something rawer than fear. Gus hesitated, then tossed his spatula onto the counter and grabbed a kitchen towel, grumbling under his breath. This is an all-night diner, not a combat zone. But even he moved toward the booth. Vero watched them both, something flickering in his eyes that Mira couldn't name. Something like regret. Or maybe recognition. An unwelcome reminder that kindness still existed, even in the aftermath of attempted violence. She reached the boy and knelt beside him. He flinched but didn't have the strength to recoil. Up close, he looked younger than she'd realized. Barely mid-20s. Too young to have decided death was a profession. His eyes were glassy with pain, with humiliation, with something else beneath the surface. A quiet, startled grief at the mess he'd become. "Press here," she murmured, guiding his hand to the wound. He obeyed, jaw clenching. Mira didn't understand why she helped him. She only knew she couldn't watch someone bleed and do nothing, not even someone who almost killed her. Her father had once said, "Some people make choices out of fear, not malice. Be careful judging the difference." She saw the difference now. Vero took a step closer, but Mira didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. The newcomer's warning still haunted the air. This wasn't over. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick with the kind of darkness that hides cars with tinted windows and men making phone calls beneath street lamps. The storm clouds above the highway sagged with the threat of rain but refused to break yet, as if waiting for permission. Vero finally spoke, his voice low, gravel pulled from deep inside. "They won't stop here." Gus cursed under his breath. Harvey looked like he wished he had slept through everything. Mira kept her hand steady on the towel. "Then what do we do?" For the first time since she'd met him, Vero hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer. Because the answer had always belonged to a life he was trying to leave behind. He glanced at the door the men had walked out of, the night swallowing them with a silence that wasn't peace. His shoulders tightened in a way that meant he was thinking through layers, alliances, betrayals, histories. He was a man who had once walked through labyrinths of danger without fear. Now he was weighing how to navigate one that involved someone innocent. Leaving isn't enough, he finally said. If we walk out, they follow. If you stay, they return. The cook stepped forward. Hold up, are you saying they'll come back here? For her? For us. Vero gave a single nod. It carried the certainty of someone who had lived too long with inevitabilities. Gus swore again, a string of words that didn't help anyone. Mira exhaled slowly, her breath tremoring at the edges. She had always believed her life was ordinary, small, predictable. She clocked in, clocked out, checked on her elderly neighbors, visited her father's grave on Sundays, folded laundry on the couch while the news talked about crimes happening far from her world. Now crime had taken a seat in her booth. Vero watched her face shift from fear to something colder, understanding. He almost spoke, almost offered an apology that would not fix anything, but Mira did something unexpected. She stood. She steadied herself. And she looked at him, not as a myth, not as a danger, but as a man who had brought the past into her present, even unintentionally. She asked a question she did not prepare, a question pulled from instinct and exhaustion and something older. Why did they want you dead tonight? Vero inhaled, slow and deep, and in that breath Mira understood she had just touched the root. He didn't answer immediately. Answers like his weren't quick. They were shaped by years and blood and decisions that had grown into chains. Finally he said, "Because I tried to leave." He didn't elaborate, but those 4 words carried an entire book. Gus shook his head. "Leave what?" Vero looked at Mira. Direct. Unmasked. "Everything," he said. "My name. My work. The men who think they own my story." The wounded boy scoffed weakly. "He abandoned us." Vero's eyes hardened, but not in anger, in sorrow. "You weren't supposed to be part of this world. You just didn't see the way out." Mira felt the boy's breath. Fast. Shallow. A wounded animal caught between 2 predators who had once been the same species. The highway outside seemed to pause. A truck slowed as it passed. Vero continued. "I spent years building power. Lining pockets. Controlling everything I touched. And then one day the faces around me changed. Younger. Hungrier. Less afraid of the consequences I used to fear for them." His gaze shifted briefly to the boy. "Men like him," he said softly, "never got taught the cost. They only got taught the reward." The boy's eyes glistened with something Mira couldn't interpret. Anger, shame, or the first crack of self-awareness. Vero's voice deepened. "I wanted out. Clean. Quiet. I thought I could vanish. Leave something behind that wasn't poison." He looked at Mira again. "And that was my mistake." Her breath caught. For a reason she didn't understand. Gus rubbed his forehead. "So what now? You planning to keep playing hide and seek in my diner?" Vero didn't even blink. "No." "Then what?" Harvey croaked. Vero turned fully toward Mira, the scar beneath his eye catching the soft light. "Now," he said, "I make sure you survive this." Mira flinched at the weight of his words. As if survival had been handed to her like a responsibility, not a promise. The young assassin spoke again, voice thin with pain. "They won't let you. They'll come. More than 2. More than before." Vero nodded once. "I know." Mira felt her heartbeat thud against her ribs. Gus swallowed hard and asked the question Mira didn't want to hear but needed answered. "Then what do we do until they get here?" Vero looked around the diner, at the exits, the layout, the angles, like a man studying a battlefield he had not chosen but was forced to command. His jaw set, he walked toward Mira with deliberate steps, stopping only when he was close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. "Act now," he said quietly, "or we won't get the chance to act at all." Mira stared back at him, hearing not just the urgency, but something beneath it. Something that trembled in the air between them. A truth he wasn't ready to say. A truth she wasn't ready to face. Something linking them not only to the past, but to what was coming next. And somewhere outside, beyond the neon glow and the restless highway, another engine turned into the parking lot. The engine's low growl rolled into the parking lot like a warning disguised as a greeting. It didn't roar. It didn't screech. It arrived with the steady calm of inevitability, the kind of calm that meant whoever stepped out of it wasn't here to negotiate. Inside the diner, something shifted in the air. Not panic. Not frenzy. A thick, sinking awareness, the kind that only settles in rooms where people understand that the next few minutes may hold a lifetime's worth of consequences. Gus froze halfway to the coffee station. Harvey, the trucker, swallowed an old fear he hadn't felt since a roared at the window with dread blooming beneath his pain. Mira felt her skin tighten with the quiet clarity that comes when instinct no longer speaks, it shouts. Vero turned toward the sound, his body straightening in a way that erased his age. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked ready, not for victory but for truth. Because men like him didn't get to choose between winning and losing. They chose between sacrifice and aftermath. He took 3 slow steps toward the front of the diner, then stopped. Not because he feared what was outside, but because he needed one last look at the woman fate had braided into his story without asking permission. Mira held his gaze. She didn't speak. She didn't ask what was coming. Her silence wasn't ignorance anymore. It was acceptance, the kind born in the aftermath of a gunshot that missed its mark by the width of a miracle. Outside, the car door opened. A single foot hit the pavement. Measured. Controlled. Almost ceremonial. The young assassin groaned, pressing harder against his wound. His fear wasn't for himself, it was for the newcomer. The second wave. Who is it? Mira asked softly, her voice steady though her body trembled. Vero's jaw tightened. The one they send, he said, when they want a story to end quietly. The words were simple. Their meaning wasn't. This wasn't just another killer. This wasn't a boy trying to prove himself. This wasn't someone who could be talked down by mercy or memory. This was the man who cleaned up the mess when the first attempt failed. He stepped into view under the buzzing neon. The rain finally began to fall thin, cold drops carving silver lines down his coat. He didn't flinch from it. Men like him didn't recognize rain as discomfort. They recognized it as cover. He wasn't big. He wasn't loud. He wasn't monstrous. He was ordinary looking in a way that terrified. The kind of ordinary that vanishes into crowds, into airports, into family photos, into obituaries. He walked toward the diner with his hands in his pockets. Not hiding them. Just keeping them warm. Death rarely rushes. Vero moved slightly, placing himself between the windows and Mira out of instinct. An instinct older than his sins and deeper than the ledger he'd spent years trying to burn. Behind them, the cook whispered a prayer he hadn't used since his wife left. Harvey muttered something desperate about staying hidden. The young assassin stared at the door with the expression of someone who had finally realized the price of loyalty in the wrong direction. Mira took a breath that felt too big for her lungs. What happens when he comes inside? She asked. Vero didn't look back at her. Everything, he said, changes. It wasn't a warning. It was truth. Spoken by a man who had lived long enough to recognize the moment a story stops being about survival and becomes about legacy. The door opened with a tired ring chime that had welcomed customers for decades. Tonight, it sounded like the toll of an old bell. He stepped inside. Rain slipped in behind him, gathering in small pools beneath his shoes. His coat was unbuttoned, his shirt collar crisp, his face unremarkable. But his eyes held the patience of a man who had all the time in the world, and none at all. He scanned the diner, not with the frantic assessment of the boy, not with the calculating detachment of the earlier handler. He scanned like a man who had been here before. And then his gaze landed on Vero. There was no shock, no satisfaction, just recognition, deep and inevitable. He spoke first. Not loudly, not dramatically. I told them you wouldn't go quietly. Vero didn't respond. Silence gathered between them, thick and ancient. Mira could feel it. A silence filled with memory she wasn't invited into. History she couldn't touch. Promises that had broken long before she arrived in this story. The man continued. You should have left the city clean. Instead you left fragments. His eyes drifted to Mira. And in that single glance, she understood the most terrifying truth of the night. He wasn't here to kill Vero. He was here to erase the witnesses. Her pulse faltered. Vero saw it too. Don't, he said quietly. Not a command. A plea. A word from a man who had rarely pleaded for anything. The newcomer tilted his head. That waitress isn't part of your past, he said. She doesn't have to be part of your ending. His meaning was clear. She could die quietly, or she could disappear from the equation entirely. Mira stepped forward before she even realized she was moving. If you're here to finish something, she said, don't touch them. The room went still. Even the rain outside paused between drops. No one had ever spoken to this man that way. He wasn't insulted. He was curious. He looked at her as if seeing a new variable on a chessboard he thought he'd memorized. What makes you think you understand this? He asked. Mira didn't break. I don't, she said. But I know what he did for my father. And what he did for me tonight. The newcomer shifted slightly. His eyes flicked to the young assassin bleeding in the booth. You think kindness is currency here? He asked her. Mira swallowed. No, she answered. But I think humanity is. Something flickered in his face. Barely. But it was there. The boy in the booth spoke then, unexpected, his voice thin but fierce. She saved me. Everyone turned. I would have bled out if she didn't help. She could have let me die. His voice cracked. This was not the man who had pulled a gun minutes earlier. This was the boy who had been swallowed whole by a word at him with a disappointment that was almost paternal. You were supposed to finish, he said. The boy shook his head, voice trembling. She didn't owe me anything. The man near the door took a long breath. Then, he closed his eyes, and the decision formed in the air between them, solid and irreversible. When he opened his eyes again, they were colder than the night outside. This won't be clean, he said to Vero. You know that. Vero nodded once. I do. You know they'll come after me too. I do. And after her. His voice softened when he said her. Vero didn't look at Mira. He didn't need to. His answer lived in the silence. The newcomer's shoulders shifted, an acknowledgement so quiet it felt like the world almost missed it. Then this isn't a hit, he said. His fingers brushed the inside of his coat. Mira froze. Gus swore. Harvey ducked. The boy gasped. But the man didn't draw a gun. He drew an envelope. Thick. Sealed. Worn at the edges. He placed it on an empty table. You were right, he said. You should have left years ago. Now all of us pay. Vero stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a grave. The man continued. You get one night. One. After that, the city will decide what happens to all of us. Mira felt the floor tilt under her. The man walked backward toward the door, not retreating, but withdrawing like a storm moving to the next town. At the door he paused. He said a final sentence that Mira would remember for the rest of her life. There are men who kill for a living. And there are men who die because they tried to live. Then he stepped out into the rain. The door closed. The bell rang one last time. And the night swallowed him whole. The diner was left with 4 people. One wounded. One shaken. One terrified. And one man whose past had finally come home to demand its due. Mira turned to Vero. What's in the envelope? She whispered. Vero stared at it. Pain flickered in his eyes. Everything, he said. The thing that ends this, or ends us. He didn't open it. Not yet. Because opening it meant facing the truth he had spent a lifetime outrunning. And the truth Mira had now stepped into without ever knowing the cost. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the diner waited for the moment that would change everything. Again. Rain thickened against the diner windows, soft at first, then harder, like fingers drumming a warning on the glass. The neon outside flickered, its red glow quivering over chrome, casting long trembling shadows across tables that had only known spilled coffee and late-night loneliness. Now they knew fear. The envelope sat between Mira and Vero like a living thing. A pulse. A weight. A truth waiting to be unsealed. It didn't belong in this diner. It belonged in boardroom. Didn't sleep unless someone else kept watch. But tonight, destiny had placed it on a table sticky with syrup beneath a clock that would never tick again. Vero didn't touch it. Not yet. He stared at it with the same expression a man might have staring into a coffin he knows belongs to him but refuses to lie in. Mira watched him, her breath shallow, her body still trembling from the chaos, though she hid it as best she could. Her bruises had begun to darken. Her wrists burned. Her thoughts spun in circles, but her eyes stayed steady on him. He was unraveling silently. Not from fear. From recognition. Recognition that everything he had built, everything he had tried to walk away from, everything he had buried, was in that envelope. The young assassin shifted, wincing. Gus had finally wrapped his wound in towels and duct tape, the closest thing to first aid the diner had. But the boy was still pale, dizzy, and ashamed. Shame wasn't something Mira ever expected to see in a man who had aimed a barrel at her heart. But she saw it now, raw and honest. "I need to know what's inside," she said softly. Vero's eyes flicked to hers. For the first time tonight she saw fear there. Not for himself. For her. "You don't," he said. But his voice wasn't firm. It was tired. Tired in a way that suggested he knew she was right. Gus leaned against the counter, spatula dangling like the last piece of normalcy left in the room. "If that envelope brings more men down on us, I want to know what we're dying for." "Speak for yourself," the trucker croaked from his booth. "I want to live through this shift." The young assassin shook his head weakly. "If you open it, it won't matter. They'll come either way." Vero looked at him and something softened in his face. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, but understanding. He knew what it meant to be young and desperate and taught the wrong things. He stepped toward the table. His fingers hovered over the envelope. He didn't pick it up. He whispered instead. "I made a mistake years ago. I built something I couldn't control. I trusted men I shouldn't have. And I tried to fix it too late." Mira swallowed, heart tightening. "What's in there?" she asked again. He exhaled long and slow. "Names, money routes, leverage. Enough to bring down the men who want me dead. Enough to ignite a war between the ones who want to take my place. And you kept this, why?" "Because walking away clean," Vero murmured, "is a lie men like me tell ourselves. Every road out leads back in unless you burn the whole map." The boy shifted, voice faint. "They said you betrayed us. That you were selling secrets." Vero looked at him, and for the first time, the quiet steel of truth rose in his voice. "I wasn't selling anything. I was giving it away. To people who could use it for something other than crime." Myra's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" she asked. Vero turned to her fully. She had never seen someone look guilty and noble in the same expression. It was a contradiction carved by time. "I tried to dismantle what I built," he admitted. "Piece by piece. Quietly. Carefully. Is that what this is?" she asked, pointing to the envelope. He nodded once. "It's my confession," he said. "And my insurance." Gus's spatula clattered to the floor. Harvey muttered something about wishing he'd eaten somewhere else. Mira stepped closer. "Why not turn this into the police?" Vero's laugh was soft and sad. "Because the police are in it." A pause. "Not all. But enough." The young assassin stared at him in disbelief, betrayal cutting deeper than the knife wound. You were trying to destroy everything?" "No," Vero said quietly. "I was trying to save what could be saved. The rest deserved to die." Mira understood now why the men came tonight. Not because Vero was a threat to their operations. Because he was a threat to the narrative. He wasn't leaving corruption. He was erasing it. The front windows pulsed with headlights passing on the rainy highway. They cast long streaks of light across Vero's face, illuminating the years he carried. "What do they want now?" Mira asked. "To silence me," he said. "And anyone standing near me." Her breath trembled. "And the envelope? Is the only thing stopping them from walking back inside." Silence gathered like fog. He finally touched it. But instead of opening it, he placed it in her hands. Mira jerked back, startled. "What?" "No. I don't, Vero, I can't." "You have to," he said. His voice held no request. Only truth. "You're the only one in this room," he said, "who isn't part of the past." She shook her head. "I don't know how to use this. I don't know who these people are. I don't know." "You're the one they won't expect," he interrupted softly. "The one they won't think to look for. The one they won't see coming. And the only one whose hands are still clean enough to carry something that can reshape everything." Mira felt the thickness of the envelope against her palms. It felt warm though the room was cold. Like it had absorbed the heat of the lives tied to its contents. "What are you asking me to do?" she whispered. Vero stepped closer. His voice lowered, deep and quiet. I'm asking you to outlive this night. Her heart thudded painfully. And if I refuse? Then the men who walked away, he said, won't. A pause. They'll come back for all of us. The boy swallowed hard. Gus cursed softly. Harvey closed his eyes like a man whispering a silent prayer into the cracks of his life. Mira looked down at the envelope. She didn't ask for this. She didn't want this. She wanted her simple life, her pocket. But fate had chosen her long before tonight. Fate had begun choosing her the night a stranger with a scar saved her father, turning her into a thread in a tapestry she never saw being sewn. She looked at Vero. He wasn't the monster the news painted. He wasn't the hero of her father's stories. He wasn't the myth teenagers whispered about. He was a man standing on the edge of his story, asking someone else to carry the final chapter forward. Why me? She asked again, voice trembling. Vero's answer was simple. Because you're the only one with something left to lose. The truth hit her like a breath she couldn't catch. She held the envelope closer to her chest. And in that moment, that quiet, fragile moment, the diner lights flickered again. Not from the breaker. Not from the storm. From headlights. A third car pulled into the parking lot. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Everyone froze. Vero turned toward the door, every muscle in his body going still. Mira felt the envelope pulse against her ribs, like a heartbeat sinking itself to danger. The boy whispered, horrified. They're early. Gus stepped behind the counter. Harvey ducked again. The rain turned from steady drizzle into a downpour, pounding at the roof like fists. Myra's breath fogged in the air. Vero looked at her. A look that said everything words didn't have time to. Stay behind me. But she didn't. She stepped beside him. A choice made not in bravery, but in fate. Because the story wasn't ending. It was moving toward its truth. The door handle turned. Act 9. The door opened slowly. Not kicked in, not shoved, not rushed. Just eased inward with the confidence of someone who didn't need force to command a room. Rain curled around the frame, drifting inside in soft mist as a tall figure stepped across the threshold. This one was different. Not dressed like an assassin. Not moving like a soldier. Not shaped by violence alone. He wore a charcoal coat, rain beads sliding down its shoulders, his collar turned up against the storm. His posture was almost elegant. Measured, deliberate, composed. The kind of posture that belonged to a man who had spent his life in rooms with heavy curtains and deeper secrets. But it was his eyes that silenced the room. Not cold. Not cruel. Not empty. His eyes held knowledge. The knowledge of someone who did not guess at truths. He kept them. Vero inhaled sharply. Mira noticed. It was the only time that night she'd seen fear touch him. Not panic. Not helplessness. Recognition. The man looked around the diner. Not hurriedly, not with suspicion, not even with curiosity. He observed. He absorbed. The broken clock. The wounded boy. The trembling trucker. Gus gripping the counter. Envelope pressed against Myra's ribs. His gaze found everything in the room without appearing to search for anything. And when he finished his quiet inventory, he spoke. Vero. His voice held history. Vero straightened. Simon. The name dropped into the diner like a stone into still water. Silent impact spreading consequences. The young assassin paled. Gus whispered. Oh hell. Even Harvey seemed to stop breathing. Mira said nothing. She didn't know the name. But the way the boy shrank, the way Vero's jaw tightened, the way every light in the diner felt suddenly colder, told her this was the man behind the men behind the men. Simon didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room like a shadow stretching across a map. You've caused a very large mess tonight, he said. Vero didn't respond. Not out of fear, there was no point to fear now. But because the moment had arrived when old stories reached the point of no return. Simon sighed, looking at the wounded boy. You weren't ready. The boy lowered his eyes, shame folding him inward. But Simon didn't blame him cruelly. He moved his gaze to Mira. Steady, inquisitive, unreadable. And you, he said. Mira felt the weight of it ripple through her bones. You're the outlier. The word hit her like a physical touch. Simon nodded thoughtfully, as if confirming something to himself. She shouldn't be here. he said to Vero. But she is. And that changes everything. Vero finally spoke. Leave her out of this. Simon's eyes softened strangely. I didn't come for her, he said. I came because men with less patience than me are circling this place. And because you, he turned fully toward Vero, have decided to burn the world we built. Vero stepped slightly in front of Mira. It was instinct now, reflexive, unthinking, necessary. Simon noticed. You never protected anyone before, he said. This must be new for you. Vero didn't deny it. Simon continued, his tone neither mocking nor impressed, simply stating the truth. She reminds you of someone, he said. Maybe several someones. A pause. Maybe yourself. Myra's breath caught. Vero's eyes flickered. Simon turned toward the windows, watching the rain. 3 cars, he murmured. One with the impatient ones. One with the frightened ones. And one with the cleaners. Vero stiffened. Mira didn't understand the jargon, but she understood the danger. You didn't come to kill me, Vero said quietly. No, Simon replied. If I wanted you gone, you'd never have seen me enter. Mira shivered. But you did come to finish something, Vero said. Simon nodded. Yes. The story. He turned back toward them, eyes settling on Mira again. She holds the envelope? Vero hesitated. Leave had been altered in the night. She's the variable, he murmured. The disruption. The reason the earlier attempts failed. He stepped closer, one slow step. Mira didn't back away. Simon watched her with the kind of gaze that stripped everything down to truth. You know why the world breaks? He asked quietly. Because people like you exist. People who don't belong in the fault lines but fall into them anyway. People who shouldn't matter to history but end up being the hinge it turns on. He nodded at the envelope. You don't know what you're holding. I know enough, Mira whispered. Simon's eyes darkened. Not in anger but in respect. You shouldn't, he said softly. And yet here we are. He turned to Vero. You always said you'd die fixing what you broke. Vero didn't deny it. Tonight, Simon continued, you came close. A silence spread. Simon let it breathe, then said, you have one choice left. Vero waited. Simon's voice lowered, steady as rain. Let her leave. Not out of fear. Not out of debt. But because her story should not end inside yours. Vero glanced at Mira. A glance filled with a lifetime of feeling he hadn't earned, pain he hadn't voiced, and truth he had carried alone. Myra's chest tightened painfully. I'm not leaving you, she whispered. Simon watched them both. Bravery, he said, is a beautiful flaw. He stepped back. He lifted a hand, and for a split second Mira thought he was reaching into his coat again. But he wasn't. He held out a small plastic keycard. This opens a locker at Union Central Station, he said. Inside is enough evidence to bring down 6 men who want him dead, and 12 who don't yet know they should be afraid. Vero's eyes widened. You kept it. Simon smiled, a tired, heavy smile. I kept everything, he said. You think I didn't know you were dismantling the old network? I knew. I just wanted to see if you could. He nodded at Mira. And then you met her. The rain thundered outside. The diner lights flickered again. Somewhere on the highway, a horn blared like a warning. You two walk out that back door in the next 60 seconds, Simon said. And the cars outside will follow me instead. Vero stared at him. Why? He asked. Simon's answer was the closest thing to mercy violence had ever spoken aloud. Because you saved the wrong child once, he said. And tonight she saved you. He nodded toward Mira. I don't kill stories like hers. I protect them. He stepped toward the exit and paused. This war is coming whether you want it or not, he said. But you won't win it here. He pushed the door open. Rain swallowed him. He was gone, leaving the diner silent, broken, echoing with the weight of every choice made. Nodding. He didn't reach for her hand, but she reached for his. And together, with the envelope between them, with danger outside, with Simon's warning in their ribs, they walked toward the back door of the diner. The rain hit them like truth. Cold, relentless, cleansing. They didn't look back. Some stories end in violence. Some end in darkness. But theirs was only beginning. And somewhere behind them the neon sign sputtered, flickered, and finally went dark. "Don't move," that was the whisper that stopped a bullet and restarted a life. In a lonely diner on a rain-soaked night, a waitress saved a dangerous man, not because he deserved saving, but because kindness echoes louder than fear. And as they vanished into the storm with the truth pressed between them, the world didn't end. It simply turned its page. And